Greetings everyone, happy Friday, and welcome to Ask Shane Anything. This show basically happens because some of y'all are pledging at $7 or more per month at our Patreon at patreon.com/SIFTD. That is the Ask Shane tier. Now, if you pledge at that tier, you get priority in asking questions, though we do accept questions from everyone, and everybody gets to watch the show. But again, if you like this show and you can't afford to pledge at that tier, maybe thank the people that are, because that's why this show happens. We have another great lineup of questions from you guys. Let's get right to them. First up, we have a question from Bachby. If Dragon Age the Veilguard fails, beyond shutting down BioWare, what do you think will happen to BioWare's IP? Do you think EA would sell it to Microsoft, Sony, or another company? Would it be smarter for them to look at the success Larian has had with Baldur's Gate 3 and hold the IP in perpetuity? Okay, I'm just going to start this answer by saying I do not think that there is any way that Dragon Age the Veilguard is going to bomb. They may say, hey, why would you think that? Don't forget Mass Effect Andromeda and all that. I hear you. But I can just tell you right now that Dragon Age the Veilguard is tracking as one of the top games on SIFTD and has been pretty much since they showed the first gameplay of the game. And I think a lot of people were reluctant to get behind the game before they saw the first gameplay, and then BioWare just drops like a 15-minute chunk. And honestly, I think that convinced pretty much everybody that, like, okay, this feels like Dragon Age. And again, I agree. In the back of every BioWare's fan's mind, there is Mass Effect Andromeda. Now, I'm not going to get on an Andromeda rant here. I will just say that I thought it was a pretty good action game. I can see where fans of the franchise maybe didn't like it that much, but I do think that game got beat up way more than it deserves. But anyway, I digress. Let's go back to Dragon Age the Veilguard. You guys love it. You guys are all over it. Like, our metrics that you guys can't see, that game is over the moon. And it only keeps growing stronger since they showed the first gameplay. So, first of all, I don't think there's any way that the game does not at least do okay. Now, again, reviews could be terrible. It could get a 6 or a 7 out of 10 or something like that. And then I still think it would probably do okay. Because, for whatever reason, there are huge Dragon Age fans out there. I've never been one of them, but there are tons of them. So again, I don't think it's going to fail. It could, but I would give it like a 5 to 10% chance of that. But I'm still going to answer your question as if it will fail. Would EA consider selling BioWare's IP to other studios? I do not think so. I mean, it's possible. Could a PlayStation or a Nintendo or a Microsoft be willing to spend enough money that EA would sell it? Maybe, but there's just so much cachet there as far as like just naming a game something and having interest built into it immediately just because of the game's title. And it's hard to put a price on that. Now, ultimately, it's up to the publisher or the developer to deliver on that IP and make a game that people actually want to play, but you have a leg up immediately. Anytime a game is named Mass Effect anything or Dragon Age anything, people are going to pay attention. And that is like a huge hurdle for pretty much every game, is to get people to care. That's why IP is so valuable. So could they sell it? Yes. Would they sell it? It is EA, and I've seen EA do some pretty crazy stuff. So if there were a major publisher that I could see doing something that's stupid, it might be EA. But even EA, I don't think it understands the power of IP. So I really struggle to see that happening, but if it did happen, who would it sell it to? Who could afford that stuff at this point? Maybe a Ubisoft? That those games kind of fit in Ubisoft's wheelhouse. It makes sense. Take-Two is always in the mix for a buyer of anything because obviously it prints money with Grand Theft Auto. So it's always in the consideration, and that may be actually the more likely candidate of those two is Take-Two. So I would probably say that that would be the most likely to plunk down the money for this IP. But honestly, it is some of the most valuable IP in the industry. Think about it. PlayStation spent like $3 billion for Destiny. So imagine what, if you had bundled those two together, if you had Mass Effect and Dragon Age together as one bundle, how much that would fetch. Or even individually, Mass Effect probably worth $4 billion? 5 billion. Dragon Age probably worth 3.5, something like that. Not a cheap purchase at all. So any publisher or potential buyer would have to be really interested and would have to have a really good plan on how to carry that IP forward. Now, the question becomes, like, the IP without the BioWare developers, does that matter all that much anymore? Since BioWare hasn't really delivered big time on a game in quite a while, we always talk about that. It's like, well, when you buy an IP, you're just buying a logo and the name. You're not buying the talent who actually makes it. But honestly, a lot of BioWare fans, that may not bother them all that much if you cleaned house and brought in a new crew to make the game. So BioWare is a unique proposition in this industry. There are a few developers that had, and I say that in past tense, had built up such a huge cachet with his fan base. Blizzard would be another one, but I think people soured a little bit on Blizzard over the last half decade maybe. But I do think that those two IPs are pretty bulletproof. So anyone who might be interested in buying them, if they can get them at a moderate price, I think it would be a really smart move. However, I just simply don't see it happening. Okay, next up, we have a question from our main man, Kevin. As a European, I have a hard time figuring out why EA's College Football 25 is so popular. I know you talked a bit about it on GameFace, but could you perhaps dive a bit deeper into why the game is so popular for us clueless Europeans who only care about soccer? First of all, Kevin, I appreciate that you called it soccer instead of football at the end there. I think you only did that because we're talking about American football in this question, but I still appreciate it. As Matt said on GameFace, soccer actually comes from Europe. We did not invent the word soccer. People in Europe did. But anyway, this is a great question, actually. And I could see where someone who doesn't live in the United States would have problems understanding why college football is so big here. But it is very simple. One, America is gigantic. Like, when I go to Europe and I travel around Europe on the train or whatever, going from country to country there is like going from state to state here. It's like the same, like the states are basically the same size as a lot of countries in Europe, and the travel time is about the same. And now remember, there are 48 states in the continental US. So the thing is America is gigantic, and people love American football here. And there aren't enough NFL teams to satisfy all those people. Once you get away from the East Coast or the West Coast, all in the middle there aren't many NFL teams. You got like the Bears in there, you have the Kansas City Chiefs in there, you have the Minnesota Vikings in there. There are a few Midwest teams, but once you get past Chicago going west, like it takes almost until like Colorado until you get to another NFL team, or if you go a little more south, you have to wait till you get to Texas or Louisiana. So there are huge swatches of land in America that have no NFL football team nearby for people to root for. And so instead, they root for the local college football team. I'm from Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, in fact. Central Pennsylvania, whether you went to Penn State or not for school, you're a Penn State fan. It drives me bonkers, but that's the way it is. Where I come from, everybody's a Penn State fan as far as college football is concerned. Now, my alma mater is over in Philly, which is Temple. And then in Pittsburgh, you have the University of Pittsburgh. And obviously those schools have fans in those areas of Pennsylvania. But all in the middle, it's all Penn State. And that's the way it is all over the entire United States. Like you get to the South and the Southern Midwest and places like that, there are no major cities. And there's no NFL football teams to root for. And so they all find the local college team and they root for it. And they root for those college football teams just as hard as I root for the Steelers or someone in Philadelphia roots for the Eagles. Those are, for all intents and purposes, their pro football team. Now, obviously, a lot of people in areas do go to those schools as well. And so, I went to Temple. Have I turned anyone into my family into Temple football fans? No, because they're terrible. Their football program is really bad. But there's a lot of people who go to schools like Pitt or go to like Penn State, and then they come back to their family, and suddenly their whole family, they're Penn State fans now. That does happen. And so that's why you get this big groundswell of people in America who love college football. That's why, you look at a school like Auburn, and if you live in Europe, you're like, what the hell's Auburn? Like, where is that at? But they have this huge contingency of rabid fans because there's no other big-time football in the area for people to go and support, even if people, again, didn't go to Auburn. So it is a strange thing, but I think a big part of it has to do with America's geography. Now, here's the better question for you. Why was EA's College Football 25 one of the best-selling games in Europe last month? I think it came in at like fourth or fifth best-selling game in Europe. Why would that be? That's the better question. People who have no regional affinity with anything in those games. I mean, Madden, I don't think, ever really breaks into the top 10 sales in Europe. And obviously the Jacksonville Jaguars have kind of become the surrogate team for London. And there's games in Europe all the time, and there was NFL Europe for a long time, which was the farm league for the NFL. Despite all that, people don't really care about NFL football there. They definitely don't buy Madden. So I have no idea why college football did well in Europe. Maybe you can help me with that one. Okay, our final question for this week's episode comes from Vincent. With the recent reminiscing on the Xbox 360, it has me thinking that the 360 was one of the most important consoles for the games industry at large. It turned gaming mainstream for both hardcore and casual players. The NES also goes on that list for saving gaming in the West post-crash, but I'm not sure on a third. PS2 sounds right, but Wii and maybe even Switch could also fit. What are your thoughts on the most important gaming consoles? Well, I think you chose well. I think the NES is one of the most important consoles because without it, who knows what the gaming industry would be like now or if there would even be one. I tend to think there probably would be, but it still took someone like Nintendo to believe in it after the crash and say, you know what? People are going to love this. We believe in it. We're going to keep pushing it. And Nintendo did it with the NES, and it worked, and here we are today. So no doubt, the NES is really important. Your other pick, the Xbox 360, yes, I agree. It really kind of ushered everybody into what modern gaming was going to be. I actually talked about that last week on Ask Shane Anything when you guys asked me for my memories about it, so I'm not going to belate that point, but I agree with you. Xbox 360 was really important. PS2. I think sometimes you tend to look at importance for this stuff based on sales. And if that's the case, PS2 was really important. I mean, I guess the one thing I would say about the PS2 that made it important is that it was the first console where its sales just went into like the stratosphere. I know it's easy to look back on like the PlayStation 1 and the Super Nintendo, but I mean, those consoles struggled to sell like 30 million. PlayStation 2 was the first one where it went from like 30, 40-ish million to like 100 and some million. And that's important because it helped in addition to the PS1. I think it helped adults accept gaming as a viable hobby. And I think a big part of that was PlayStation 1 allowing more adult-oriented games on the platform and that continuing with the PlayStation 2. So I do feel like it ushered in, those two consoles in particular, ushered in a new demographic to gaming who continue to support gaming to this day. And without them, we wouldn't be doing this right now on SIFTD. It just simply wouldn't exist. So PS2, very important as well. But if I had to add a third to that list that you mentioned, for me, it would be the Atari 2600. Because without it, none of this happens. None of it. Think about the guts it took at Atari to invest all that money in R&D on a gaming console that you can play at home. Also, keep in mind, the technology at the time was so primitive. And the amount of money Atari would have to spend to create a console, and we would have to spend to buy a console that would work in the home and not be completely terrible. Now, I'll admit, Atari 2600 was right on the edge, man, of barely being good enough. I mean, it was very crude, but it was good enough for me. Being able to buy a game and take it home and play it as much as I want without having to spend a quarter every like 90 seconds or every 2 minutes or whatever, that was a revelation. And I'll be honest with you, that was enough for me and my friends to be like, I want an Atari 2600. Just being able to play video games in that different context where it's not the arcade and the games aren't built to make you keep putting the quarters in every 90 seconds. So it affected the game design of how games could be designed, again, in perpetuity for decades to come. It developed the razor and razor blade model for gaming, where, you know, sometimes they're going to lose some money on the hardware, but they make it all up when you buy the games, when you buy the razors. Like, it established so much about how console gaming was going to work, and literally, there are echoes of the Atari 2600 still reverberating today in 2024. So if I had to pick the three most important consoles, I agree with you on the first two. It would be the NES and the Xbox 360 with the PS2 real close right there. And then for me, the third one would be the Atari 2600. Okay, that's it for this edition of Ask Shane Anything. I hope all you guys and girls have an awesome weekend planned. People watching this later on our YouTube channel, hope you guys are having a good week. And also, before I go, I just want to say, hey, if you really like what we're doing here at SIFTD between this and some of our features and Pactor Factor and Game Face, please head to patreon.com/SIFTD and give us a pledge. It's just $4 a month to get all our content early. You get Game Face 4 days early, you get Pactor Factor a week early, you get this show like 4 or 5 days early, you get all our features 3 or 4 days early. There's really a lot of value in pledging to us, where I know a lot of other Patreons have got to the point where they aren't really holding a lot of content exclusive for their patrons anymore. We do. We try to give our patrons value. It's what matters most to us. So if you can find it in your heart to help us out, that would be awesome. Again, go to patreon.com/sifted. The big games are on the way, people. The end of August is awesome. September's awesome. October's awesome. It really looks like the rest of the year is going to be great. I'm kind of preparing myself for it here. I'm like, man, here we go. Here comes the next few months where I'm not going to be sleeping much, but I couldn't be more excited about it. So keep your browser tuned to sifted.net, and we'll enjoy the good times together. We'll see you for Game Face on Tuesday.